The first signs that something was different came not from official announcements or palace statements, but from the careful observers who had spent decades watching the royal family's every move. On that crisp September morning in 2022, as London awakened to what would become one of the most significant days in modern British history, the subtle changes in routine spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Sarah Mitchell, a florist who had supplied arrangements to Westminster for over 20 years, noticed it first. Her usual order from the palace had been quietly tripled 3 days earlier. Not the grand, colorful displays typically requested for state occasions, but something entirely different: white lilies, chrysanthemums, and roses in shades of cream and pale yellow. Flowers that spoke of remembrance, of dignity, of a love that transcends death. "I've never seen an order quite like it," she would later tell her assistant, Emma, as they carefully arranged the final bouquets in the pre-dawn darkness of their shop. Every bloom had to be perfect, not a single wilted petal, not one stem out of place. It's as if they're preparing for something sacred. Meanwhile, across London, Detective Inspector James Hartford was reviewing security protocols that had been months in the planning but were now suddenly, urgently real. He had been part of the Royal Protection Team for 15 years, had overseen security for weddings, funerals, and state visits. But nothing had prepared him for the magnitude of what was unfolding. The guest list alone was staggering. Every living former prime minister would be there. Presidents and kings from around the world were flying in. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been in meetings since dawn, and the Dean of St. Paul's had barely slept in 3 days. But it wasn't just the scale that made Hartford's job challenging, it was the emotion. "This isn't just a state occasion," he explained to his team during their final briefing at 5 a.m. "This is personal. Every single person walking into that cathedral today isn't just there as a representative of their country or their office. They're there because she touched their lives personally. That makes everything different." As the sun began to rise over London, painting the Thames in shades of gold and amber, the first of the royal family members were already awake. At Clarence House, King Charles III had been up since 4 in the morning, not because protocol demanded it, but because sleep had become impossible. His private secretary, Michael Thompson, found him in his study, reading through old letters, decades of correspondence between him and his mother that revealed a relationship far more complex and tender than the public ever knew. "She wrote to me every week when I was at school," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of memories. Even when she was traveling, even during the most challenging times of her reign, there was always a letter, always guidance, always love, even when we disagreed. Thompson, who had worked for the royal household for over 30 years, had seen the king in many different moments: triumphant, frustrated, determined, uncertain. But this morning he saw something he had never witnessed before: a son preparing to say goodbye to his mother in front of the entire world. 3 miles away, at Windsor Castle, Princess Anne was going through her own mourning rituals with characteristic efficiency. As the Queen's only daughter, she had perhaps known her mother in a way that was different from her brothers. Not just as Queen, but as a woman who had balanced impossible demands with quiet strength. Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jennifer Cromwell, watched as the princess selected her jewelry for the day. Simple pearls, a brooch that had belonged to Queen Mary, and her father's signet ring, which she wore on special occasions. She would have wanted us to be dignified, and said simply, adjusting her black dress in the mirror. But she would also have wanted us to be ourselves. She never asked anyone to be someone they weren't, including us. At Kensington Palace, the Prince and Princess of Wales were facing their own unique challenge, explaining to their children what the day would mean. Catherine had been awake since dawn, thinking about how to help George, Charlotte, and Louis understand not just the historical significance of what was happening, but the personal loss their family was experiencing. William found her in their private sitting room, looking out at the gardens where their children had played with their great-grandmother just months before. The Queen had always made time for the children, had insisted on proper visits despite her busy schedule, had taught them about duty and service not through lectures, but through her own example. She adored them, Catherine said softly, watching as their protection officers did their final security checks in the courtyard. She used to say that watching them grow was one of her greatest joys in these last years. They knew her not as the queen, but as gone. How do you explain to children that the whole world is saying goodbye to someone who is simply their beloved great-grandmother? William's answer came not in words, but in a gentle embrace. They both knew that their children would need to see their parents' strength today, would need to understand that grieving and honoring someone can happen simultaneously, that love doesn't end with death, but continues in how we carry forward the lessons we were taught. As the morning progressed, similar scenes were playing out across royal residences and in the homes of family friends who would join them at St. Paul's. Each person was dealing not just with their public role in the day's events, but with their private grief, their personal memories, and their own understanding of what the Queen had meant to them individually. Lady Susan Hussey, who had served as the Queen's lady-in-waiting for over 60 years, was perhaps facing the most difficult mourning of all. At 93, she had been not just the Queen's companion, but her confidant, the person who had witnessed the private moments that the public never saw, the laughter, the worries, the quiet acts of kindness that revealed the human heart behind a crown. People think they knew her because they saw her on television or read about her in newspapers. Lady Susan told her granddaughter, who had come to accompany her to the cathedral. But she was so much more than what the cameras captured. She was funny, genuinely funny. She had strong opinions about everything from horse breeding to international politics. She worried about her children and grandchildren just like any mother would. She loved her corgis, perhaps more than was entirely proper for someone of her position. She was extraordinary precisely because she never forgot how to be ordinary. By mid-morning, as London's streets began to fill with people making their way toward the cathedral, the magnitude of what was happening became undeniable. This wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the end of an era. The Queen had been the constant through 7 decades of tremendous change, through the collapse of the British Empire and the emergence of the Commonwealth, through the troubles in Northern Ireland and their resolution, through economic boom and bust, through family scandals and triumphs. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a historian from Oxford University, had been asked to provide commentary for the international media coverage of the day. As she prepared her notes, she reflected on the unique position the Queen had held not just in British society, but in the consciousness of the entire world. She became Queen when Harry Truman was President of the United States, Dr. Thornton explained to the BBC's anchor during a pre-ceremony interview. She outlasted 14 different prime ministers, 16 different presidents. She saw the invention of the internet, the mobile phone, social media. These quiet acts of remembrance, repeated in various forms throughout the royal family, spoke to something profound about what the day meant. It wasn't just a nation saying goodbye to their queen. It was a family preparing to honor a woman who had shown them how to balance public duty with private love, how to serve others while remaining true to themselves. As the morning sun climbed higher over London, casting long shadows across the ancient streets that led to St. Paul's Cathedral, the stage was set for something unprecedented in modern royal history. Not just a ceremony, but a genuine expression of grief, love, and gratitude from a family that had learned from their matriarch how to find strength in service to others. The Queen had often said that her role was not to be loved, but to be of service. What her family was about to demonstrate at St. Paul's Cathedral was that, in her case, those two things had become inseparable. In serving others with such dedication and grace for over 7 decades, she had indeed become beloved, not just by her subjects, but by the global family of nations and peoples whose lives she had touched through her example. As the first of the black cars began their solemn journey through London's streets, carrying the royal family toward their final public farewell, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. History was about to be made, but, more importantly, love was about to be honored in the most public and profound way possible. The motorcade began its journey through London at precisely 9:30 a.m., each vehicle spaced with military precision, yet moving with the solemnity of a funeral procession. Inside the lead car, King Charles sat in contemplative silence, watching familiar landmarks pass by the window, the same route he had traveled countless times with his mother over the decades, but never under circumstances quite like these. His private secretary, Michael Thompson, had prepared briefing notes for every dignitary they would encounter at St. Paul's, but Charles found his mind drifting instead to memories that no briefing could capture. He remembered being 8 years old, sitting beside his mother in a similar car, asking her why people always waved when they saw them pass. Her answer had been characteristically thoughtful. "They're not waving at us as individuals, Charles. They're acknowledging what we represent. Continuity, service, the idea that some things endure even when everything else seems to be changing." Now, as people lined the streets in unprecedented numbers, many holding flowers, many wiping away tears, Charles understood his mother's words in a way he never had before. They weren't just saying goodbye to Queen Elizabeth II. They were acknowledging the end of an age of stability that she had represented for most people's entire lives. In the car following, Princess and traveled with her husband, Sir Timothy Lawrence, both of them maintaining the composed bearing that had become Anne's trademark throughout her decades of public service. But those who knew her well could see the signs of barely controlled emotion, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands rested precisely folded in her lap, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. She taught us that dignity doesn't mean absence of feeling, and said quietly to Timothy as they passed Buckingham Palace, where thousands of floral tributes had transformed the formal gates into a garden of remembrance. It means finding the strength to honor what matters most, especially when it's difficult. Timothy, who had been part of the royal family for over 2 decades, had witnessed Anne's relationship with her mother evolve from dutiful daughter to trusted confidant. He knew that, and had perhaps understood the Queen's burden better than anyone else in the family, had shared not just the privileges of royal life, but its genuine challenges, the constant scrutiny, the weight of expectation, the knowledge that every word and gesture carried significance beyond the personal. 3 cars back, Prince William and Catherine traveled with their children, a journey that represented its own unique challenge. At 14, 9, and 5, George, Charlotte, and Louis were old enough to understand the gravity of the day, but young enough to need careful guidance about what they were witnessing. George, as the future heir, had spent more time with his great-grandmother than his siblings, had been taught by her personally about the responsibilities that would one day be his. During those private lessons at Windsor Castle, the Queen had shared not just the formal protocols of kingship, but her own understanding of what it meant to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. She told me that being king wasn't about being the most important person. George had confided to his father just days earlier. She said it was about being the person who helps everyone else feel important. That wisdom, delivered in the Queen's characteristically direct but gentle way, had shaped not just George's understanding of his future role, but his entire family's approach to their current responsibilities. William and Catherine had worked tirelessly to ensure their children understood privilege as an obligation to serve, not as an entitlement to special treatment. Charlotte, sitting between her brothers, held a small wooden horse that the Queen had given her on her last birthday. It was intricately carved, painted with careful detail, and had become Charlotte's most treasured possession, not because it was expensive, but because it represented hours of conversation with her great-grandmother about responsibility, kindness, and the importance of treating all people with respect. "Will people remember her forever?" Charlotte asked her mother as they approached the cathedral. Catherine's answer was immediate and certain. "Yes, darling. But not just because she was queen. They'll remember her because of how she treated people, how she kept her promises, and how she showed that being powerful means using that power to help others." The conversation in their car represented something profound about how the Queen's legacy was being passed to the next generation. Not through formal instruction, but through the lived example of how to balance public duty with private humanity. As the royal motorcade continued through London streets, similar conversations and reflections were taking place in vehicles carrying other family members and close friends. The Earl and Countess of Wessex, Edward and Sophie, were discussing their own memories of family gatherings where the Queen had been not the monarch, but simply Mama or Granny, someone who insisted on washing dishes after family dinners, who had strong opinions about television programs, who could be wonderfully silly with young children despite her formal public persona. Sophie, in particular, had developed an unexpectedly close relationship with the Queen over the years. As someone who had married into the family as an adult, she had been able to see the Queen with fresh eyes, had appreciated qualities that those born into the royal environment might take for granted. "She never made me feel like an outsider," Sophie had told her friends. From the very first time we met, she made it clear that family meant family. No conditions, no trial periods, no need to prove myself worthy. She just opened her arms and made room for one more. That inclusive spirit, that ability to expand her circle of love and concern without diminishing its intensity, had been one of the Queen's most remarkable characteristics. Whether dealing with Commonwealth leaders, visiting dignitaries, or new family members, she had possessed an unusual gift for making people feel both honored by her attention and comfortable in her presence. The motorcade's route through London had been carefully planned, not just for security reasons, but to pass landmarks that held special meaning for the Queen's 7-decade reign. As they moved through Whitehall, past the cenotaph where she had laid wreaths every Remembrance Sunday for decades, past the Palace of Westminster where she had opened Parliament annually for nearly 3/4 of a century, each location triggered its own cascade of memories and reflections. Foreign Secretary James Morrison, traveling in one of the diplomatic vehicles, found himself thinking about the dozens of state visits he had witnessed during his career. He had seen the Queen host dictators and Democrats with equal grace, had watched her navigate complex international relationships with a combination of diplomatic skill and genuine personal warmth that had made her perhaps the most effective ambassador Britain had ever had. She understood something that many politicians never learn. Morrison reflected to his deputy as they passed the Foreign Office, where he had briefed the Queen countless times over the years. She knew that relationships between nations are ultimately relationships between people. She never forgot that behind every title, every position, every flag, there was a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. That insight had shaped Britain's relationships with the Commonwealth in particular. Where other colonial powers had struggled to maintain positive connections with their former territories, the Queen had transformed the Commonwealth into something unique in international relations, a voluntary association held together not by legal obligations or economic necessity, but by genuine affection and shared values. As the motorcade approached St. Paul's Cathedral, the crowds grew denser and more emotional. People of all ages from all backgrounds had come to say their own farewells to a woman who had been the one constant in their rapidly changing world. Many held photographs, some formal portraits, others candid shots from royal visits to their communities over the decades. Mrs. Evelyn Walsh, 87 years old, had positioned herself along the route with a framed photograph of the Queen's visit to her hometown in Wales in 1979. As a young teacher then, she had been selected to present a bouquet to the Queen at the local school. The brief conversation they had shared about education and children had influenced Walsh's entire career, inspiring her to become a headmistress and, later, an educational consultant. "She asked me what I thought children needed most from their education," Walsh told a young woman standing beside her in the crowd. "When I said confidence to be themselves," she smiled and said, "Exactly. We must never try to make them into copies of us, but help them become the best versions of themselves." I've never forgotten those words. They've guided me through 40 years of working with children. That story, repeated in thousands of variations along the route, illustrated something remarkable about the Queen's impact. Despite meeting hundreds of thousands of people during her reign, she had somehow managed to make each encounter feel personal and meaningful. Teachers, nurses, soldiers, farmers, factory workers, artists, all had their own memories of moments when the Queen's attention had made them feel valued and heard. The final approach to St. Paul's Cathedral represented the culmination of not just the morning's journey, but of 7 decades of public service. As the motorcade turned onto Ludgate Hill, the great dome of Sir Christopher Wren's masterpiece came into view, its Baroque magnificence providing a fitting backdrop for what would be both a deeply personal family farewell and a moment of historical significance. Inside the lead vehicle, King Charles felt the weight of transition settling upon his shoulders. In just a few hours, he would walk into that cathedral as a son, saying goodbye to his mother. When he walked out, he would face the world as a king who had learned from the finest example of constitutional monarchy that history had ever produced. The motorcade slowed as it approached the cathedral steps, where military honor guards stood at attention and where representatives from around the world waited to offer their respects. The formal ceremony was about to begin, but the emotional journey that had brought them all to this moment, the private grief, the personal memories, the shared understanding of what they had lost, that journey would continue long after the final prayers had been said. As the first car came to a stop and the cathedral bells began their solemn toll, London itself seemed to pause in recognition of what was ending and what was beginning. The Queen's final public journey was nearly complete, but the legacy she had created through 7 decades of unwavering service would endure for generations to come. The great doors of St. Paul's Cathedral opened with a gravity that seemed to acknowledge the weight of the moment. As the first members of the royal family stepped from their vehicles and began the slow walk up the cathedral steps, the assembled crowds fell into a silence so profound that the only sound were the ceremonial bells and the rustle of formal dress against stone. King Charles emerged first, his bearing erect, but his face carrying the unmistakable marks of deep personal loss. Behind him came Camilla, the Queen consort, who had over the years developed her own relationship with the late Queen, one that had evolved from careful formality to genuine affection and mutual respect. The Queen had lived long enough to see Charles find happiness again, and she had welcomed Camilla into the family with characteristic grace and wisdom. As they climbed the steps, Charles found himself remembering his mother's words from just months earlier, during their last private conversation at Balmoral. "The crown doesn't make us special, Charles. Service does. Remember that, and you'll never go wrong." Those words had been typical of his mother, practical, direct, focused on duty rather than privilege. She had never been one for grand, philosophical discussions about the monarchy's role in modern society. Instead, she had simply demonstrated day after day for over 70 years what it meant to put service before self, duty before desire, and the needs of others before personal comfort. Following closely behind came Princess, and with her husband Timothy, his composure intact but her eyes revealing the depth of her grief. As the Queen's only daughter, and had perhaps known her mother in ways that were different from her brother's, she had seen not just the public monarch, but the private woman who worried about her children, who delighted in her grandchildren's achievements, who found genuine joy in simple pleasures like horse racing and country walks. The relationship between and her mother had been characterized by mutual respect and understanding. Both were women who valued directness over diplomacy, hard work over ceremony, and practical results over public recognition. The Queen had often said that, and was the family member most like herself, someone who understood that true service meant showing up, doing the work, and never complaining about the burden. As Anne reached the cathedral entrance, she paused briefly to acknowledge the Archbishop of Canterbury, who stood ready to conduct the service. Dr. Justin Welby had known the Queen personally for over a decade, had conducted regular private conversations with her about faith, duty, and the challenges of leadership in an increasingly complex world. She never asked for easy answers to difficult questions. Dr. Welby would later reflect about those conversations. She wanted to understand how her faith should guide her actions, how she could best serve not just her country, but her conscience. She was deeply thoughtful about the moral dimensions of her role, always seeking to do what was right rather than what was expedient. The arrival of Prince William and Catherine with their children created a particularly poignant moment. Young George, Charlotte, and Louis represented not just the future of the monarchy, but the continuation of the Queen's most cherished role, that of great-grandmother. She had delighted in their visits to Windsor Castle, had taught them about history and duty through stories, and games had shown them that being royal meant being responsible for others' well-being. George, walking with the careful dignity that had been instilled in him from an early age, carried with him the weight of future kingship, but also the comfort of knowing he had been personally prepared for that burden by the finest example of constitutional monarchy in modern history. His great-grandmother had shared with him not just the formal protocols of royal life, but her own hard-won wisdom about leading with humility and serving with joy. Charlotte and Louis, too young to fully understand the historical significance of the day, nonetheless sensed its importance through their parents' behavior and the extraordinary solemnity of their surroundings. The Queen had made special efforts to ensure that all her great-grandchildren understood their heritage not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a positive difference in the world. She told us that being royal doesn't mean being better than other people, Charlotte had explained to her school friends. It means working harder to help other people be their best selves. That understanding, passed down through careful conversation and personal example, represented perhaps the Queen's greatest gift to future generations. The knowledge that privilege without responsibility is meaningless, but that privilege combined with genuine service can change the world. As the family members took their places within the cathedral, they were joined by representatives from every Commonwealth nation, heads of state from around the world, and leaders from every sector of British society. The gathering represented something unprecedented in modern diplomatic history, a coming together of global leadership, not for a summit or negotiation, but simply to honor a woman who had dedicated her life to serving others. President Emmanuel Macron of France sat alongside President Joe Biden of the United States, both men representing nations that had sometimes disagreed with British policy but had never doubted the Queen's personal integrity and wisdom. Their presence, along with that of dozens of other world leaders, spoke to something remarkable about the Queen's global influence. She transcended politics. President Biden would later say, whether you were conservative or liberal, whether your country had historical tensions with Britain or not, you respected her because she was consistent, honest, and genuinely committed to making the world a better place. In an age of political polarization, she reminded us that some values are universal. The cathedral itself had been prepared with extraordinary care to reflect both the formal dignity of a state occasion and the personal warmth that had characterized the Queen's relationships with those she served. The flowers, arranged by Sarah Mitchell and her team, created an atmosphere of beauty without ostentation, elegance without excess, exactly what the Queen would have wanted. The music, selected personally by King Charles in consultation with his siblings, included pieces that had special meaning for the Queen, as well as traditional hymns that represented the breadth of her Commonwealth. The choir, drawn from across the Anglican Communion, represented the global nature of the institution she had led for so many decades. As the service began, the Archbishop of Canterbury's opening words captured something essential about what they were gathering to celebrate. We come together today, not just to mourn the passing of our Queen, but to give thanks for a life lived in service to others, for a reign that demonstrated the power of consistency, compassion, and commitment to the common good. Those words resonated throughout the cathedral because they captured what made the Queen's life so remarkable. In an age of celebrity culture and social media fame, she had demonstrated that true significance comes not from seeking attention, but from faithfully fulfilling one's responsibilities day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The first reading, delivered by Prime Minister Liz Truss, came from the Book of Proverbs and spoke of wisdom, integrity, and the blessings that come to those who serve others with honest hearts. As Truss spoke, many in the congregation were reminded of the Queen's weekly meetings with her prime ministers over the decades, conversations that had provided guidance and perspective to 14 different leaders across the full spectrum of political belief. Those meetings, held every Tuesday evening when the Queen was in London, had been among her most important constitutional duties. Prime Ministers from Harold Wilson to Liz Truss had spoken to the Queen's remarkable ability to ask the right questions, to offer perspective without interfering, to provide both challenge and support during their most difficult decisions. She never told us what to do, former Prime Minister Tony Blair had once observed, but she had a way of helping us think through the human consequences of our policies. She would ask about the families affected by our decisions, the communities that would be impacted, the long-term effects we might not have considered. She made us better leaders by making us more thoughtful people. The second reading, given by Commonwealth Secretary-General Patricia Scotland, spoke to the Queen's role in transforming the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations, perhaps her greatest diplomatic achievement. Under her leadership, what could have been a painful dissolution of imperial relationships had instead become a voluntary association of independent nations united by shared values and mutual respect. Secretary-General Scotland's own background, born in Dominica, raised in England, now leading an organization that spans 6 continents, embodied the Queen's vision of the Commonwealth as a family of nations where diversity was celebrated and cooperation was built on understanding rather than obligation. She showed us that leadership doesn't mean imposing your will on others, Scotland said, her voice carrying the emotion that all the speakers felt. It means creating space for others to flourish, providing support when needed, and demonstrating through your own example what it means to put service before self. As the service continued, with prayers offered in multiple languages reflecting the Commonwealth's diversity, the royal family members each dealt with their grief in characteristic ways. Charles listened intently to every word, knowing that he would soon carry the responsibility his mother had borne for so long, and sat with military straightness, honoring her mother through her own impeccable behavior. William and Catherine focused on their children, helping them understand the significance of what they were witnessing. But perhaps the most moving moment came during the singing of "The Lord's My Shepherd," a hymn that had been sung at the Queen's wedding to Prince Philip in 1947. As the familiar words filled the cathedral, many were reminded of the love story that had sustained the Queen throughout her reign, her marriage to a man who had given up his own naval career to support her in her duties, who had walked 2 steps behind her in public for over 70 years while being her equal partner in private. Prince Philip's absence from the cathedral was felt by everyone present. He had died just over a year earlier, and those who knew the Queen well understood that his loss had marked the beginning of her own final chapter. They had been partners in the truest sense, and his death had left her not just personally bereaved, but professionally diminished. She had lost her closest advisor, her strongest supporter, and her most honest critic all in one person. The congregation that filled St. Paul's Cathedral represented something unprecedented in modern history, a gathering of global leadership united not by political necessity or economic interest, but by genuine respect and affection for someone who had spent her entire adult life serving others. As the ceremony continued, it became increasingly clear that they weren't just saying goodbye to a monarch, but to an era of leadership defined by duty, dignity, and unwavering commitment to the common good. The moment came for the eulogy, and it fell to King Charles to speak not just as the new monarch, but as a son saying goodbye to his mother. As he approached the pulpit, the cathedral fell into a silence so complete that the rustle of his robes seemed amplified in the vast space. Every eye was upon him, every heart was with him, understanding that this was perhaps the most challenging speech he had ever been called upon to deliver. Charles began with words that immediately revealed the personal nature of his address. "My dear Mama taught me that service is not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It is about showing up every day and doing whatever needs to be done with grace, humor, and unwavering commitment to others' well-being." Those words set the tone for what followed, not a formal royal proclamation, but a son's honest tribute to a mother who had shown him how to balance personal feeling with public duty, how to find strength in service to others, and how to lead with both authority and humility. "She never spoke to us about the burden of the crown," Charles continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. "Instead, she showed us its privilege. The privilege of serving people who trust you with their hopes and fears, the privilege of representing values that matter more than any individual person, the privilege of being part of something larger and more enduring than ourselves." As Charles spoke, members of the congregation found themselves thinking about their own memories of the Queen. For some, those memories were professional, state visits, official ceremonies, formal meetings where her dignity and preparation had impressed them. For others, they were more personal, chance encounters where her warmth and genuine interest had left lasting impressions. Dr. David Morrison, who had served as the Queen's physician for the last 15 years of her life, listened to Charles's words and remembered countless private moments when the Queen's character had revealed itself in simple, unguarded ways. Despite her advancing age and the physical challenges that came with it, she had maintained her sense of duty until almost the very end, insisting on fulfilling her obligations even when it required considerable effort. She never complained, Dr. Morrison would later tell his colleagues. Even when she was clearly uncomfortable, even when a task required more energy than she really had, she would find a way to complete it with dignity. She understood better than anyone that duty doesn't pause for personal convenience. That dedication to duty, even in her final years, had been perhaps the Queen's most remarkable characteristic. When other people her age were focused on personal comfort and rest, she continued to work through official papers every evening to meet with ministers and advisors to stay informed about events affecting her realm and the Commonwealth. Charles's eulogy continued with more personal reflections. She taught us that being royal doesn't mean being remote. Some of my most treasured memories are of her rolling up her sleeves to help with washing up after family gatherings, of her getting genuinely excited about horse racing results, of her laughing until tears came when one of her corgis misbehaved in front of visiting dignitaries. These glimpses into the Queen's private personality resonated throughout the cathedral because they revealed the human warmth behind the formal monarchy. Foreign dignitaries who had met her during state visits nodded in recognition, remembering moments when her genuine curiosity about their countries and their lives had surprised and delighted them. Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany found himself thinking about the Queen's state visit to Berlin in 2015, when she had insisted on meeting young refugees who were learning English. Her conversations with them had been spontaneous and unscripted, revealing her genuine interest in their stories and her practical concern for their well-being. She asked them not about their past traumas, but about their hopes for the future, Scholz remembered. She wanted to know what they were learning, what careers they were planning, what they found most surprising about life in Germany. She treated them not as political symbols, but as young people whose dreams mattered. That ability to connect with people from all backgrounds and circumstances had been one of the Queen's greatest strengths as a constitutional monarch. Whether meeting with world leaders or school children, whether attending state banquets or village fetes, she had possessed an unusual gift for making people feel both honored by her attention and comfortable in her presence. As Charles spoke about his mother's relationship with the Commonwealth, the representatives from 56 nations listened with particular attention. They understood better than anyone how the Queen had transformed what could have been a bitter legacy of colonialism into something positive and collaborative. High Commissioner Nalaka Gadahua of Sri Lanka, sitting with his fellow Commonwealth representatives, reflected on how the Queen's approach to Commonwealth leadership had been fundamentally different from traditional imperial relationships. Instead of imposing British values or systems on diverse nations, she had created space for each country to develop its own identity while maintaining voluntary connections based on mutual respect. She never made us feel like junior partners, Gadahua would later observe. Even when our countries were struggling with economic challenges or political difficulties, she treated us as equals. She celebrated our successes, offered support during our troubles, and never made us feel judged for our struggles. This approach had been particularly evident during the many Commonwealth heads of government meetings over the decades. While other international organizations often became forums for political confrontation or economic competition, Commonwealth meetings under the Queen's guidance had maintained a unique atmosphere of collegiality and mutual support. Charles's speech, then, turned to his mother's relationship with faith, a topic that had been central to her understanding of her role as monarch. She drew strength from her faith, but she never used that faith to judge others or to claim special wisdom. Instead, she used it to remind herself daily that she was called to serve others, especially those who needed her protection most. This reference to the Queen's faith resonated deeply with religious leaders from many traditions who were present in the cathedral. Her annual Christmas broadcast had consistently emphasized themes of service, reconciliation, and hope, speaking to people of all faiths and none with messages that transcended religious boundaries. Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs, before his own death, had often spoken of the Queen's remarkable ability to speak from her own Christian faith while embracing the religious diversity of modern Britain. Her visits to synagogues, mosques, temples, and gurdwaras have been not mere ceremonial obligations, but genuine expressions of interest in the spiritual lives of all her subjects. She understood that in a diverse society, a monarch's role is not to impose religious uniformity, but to create space for all people to practice their faith with dignity, Rabbi Sachs had observed. She was deeply Christian in her personal beliefs, but profoundly inclusive in her public leadership. As the eulogy neared its conclusion, Charles's words became increasingly personal and emotional. She taught us that love is not just a feeling, but a commitment to show up for people whether it's convenient or not, whether they can repay you or not, whether anyone will notice or not. She kept that commitment for 7 decades, and in doing so, she showed us what it means to live a life of meaning. These words struck directly at what had made the Queen's reign so remarkable. In an age of instant communication and constant change, she had demonstrated the power of consistency. Her subjects always knew what to expect from her: dignity in crisis, steadiness during uncertainty, genuine care for their well-being, whether times were good or difficult. The congregation, filled with people from every walk of life and every corner of the world, sat in contemplative silence as Charles concluded his tribute. They had come to honor a monarch, but what they had heard was a son's testimony to a mother who had shaped not only her own family, but the character of an entire era. As Charles returned to his seat, the weight of transition was visible in his bearing. He had spoken as a son, but when he stood again, it would be as king. The formal passing of responsibility was complete, but the emotional journey of coming to terms with the loss would continue long after the ceremony ended. The final hymn, "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," filled the cathedral with a sound that seemed to embody both grief and hope, both ending and beginning. As the voices of the congregation rose together, they were not just singing a hymn, but expressing their collective commitment to carrying forward the values that the Queen had embodied throughout her remarkable life. The final prayers echoed through St. Paul's Cathedral as the service approached its conclusion, but the emotional resonance of the day was only beginning to settle into the hearts and minds of those present. As Archbishop Welby offered the closing benediction, his words seemed to capture not just the end of the ceremony, but the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. May the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, comfort all who mourn, strengthen all who serve, and guide all who lead, he said, his voice carrying the weight of both personal grief and pastoral responsibility. And may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you always. As the final Amen was spoken, the cathedral filled with the sound of movement as the congregation prepared for the recessional. But this was not just the end of service. It was the completion of an extraordinary public farewell to a woman who had shaped the consciousness of multiple generations across the globe. King Charles rose first, his bearing now unmistakably that of a monarch who had received not just the crown, but the full weight of the responsibility that came with it. Behind him, the royal family formed a procession that represented both continuity and change, the preservation of traditions that had served Britain well, combined with the subtle adaptations necessary for a new era. As they moved slowly down the cathedral's central aisle, each family member carried with them their own understanding of what the day had meant. For Charles, it represented the full assumption of the role he had been preparing for his entire life, but also the profound personal loss of the mother who had been his guide and example through 7 decades. Princess Anne, walking with characteristic composure, knew that she would now be called upon to be not just the hardest-working member of the royal family, as she had been for decades, but also a source of continuity and strength for her brother as he adapted to his new role. Her relationship with the Queen had been built on mutual respect for duty and service, and she understood that honoring her mother's memory meant continuing that commitment without reservation. Prince William and Catherine, accompanied by their children, represented the future of the institution. As they walked through the cathedral, they carried with them the responsibility of ensuring that the monarchy continued to evolve in ways that preserved its essential character while remaining relevant to changing times. The Queen had shown them through her own example how to balance tradition with adaptation, how to honor the past while serving the present. Young Prince George, walking with the careful dignity that had been instilled in him from birth, embodied the continuation of the dynasty into a 4th generation. His great-grandmother had spent considerable time ensuring that he understood his future responsibilities not as burdens, but as opportunities to serve others. The conversations they had shared during quiet moments at Windsor Castle would influence his understanding of kingship for the rest of his life. As the royal family emerged from the cathedral into the London afternoon, they were greeted by thousands of people who had waited hours simply to be present for this historic moment. The crowd's response was remarkable in its combination of respect and warmth. There was genuine grief for the Queen's passing, but also visible support for the family she had left behind. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, who had traveled from Manchester specifically to attend the service, stood with tears streaming down her face as the royal family appeared. At 91, she had lived through almost the entirety of the Queen's reign, had raised her children during the difficult years of World War II, and its aftermath, had watched her grandchildren grow up in an era of unprecedented prosperity and change. She was our constant, Mrs. Fletcher told her granddaughter, who had accompanied her on the journey to London. No matter what was happening in the world, no matter how confused everything seemed, we knew she was there. We knew she was thinking about us, caring about what happened to ordinary people like us. That kind of leadership, it's irreplaceable. That sentiment, expressed in different words by people of all ages and backgrounds who had gathered around St. Paul's, captured something essential about what made the Queen's reign so remarkable. In an era of rapid change and political turbulence, she had provided stability not through resistance to change, but through consistent demonstration of unchanging values. Dr. Sarah Williams, a political scientist from Cambridge University who had studied constitutional monarchy for over 30 years, watched the family's emergence from the cathedral with professional as well as personal interest. She understood better than most how unique the Queen's achievement had been, maintaining the relevance and respect of an ancient institution in a thoroughly modern world. She solved a puzzle that many thought was unsolvable. Dr. Williams would later write in her analysis of the day's events. How do you preserve tradition in a time of rapid change? How do you maintain authority in an age of democratic equality? How do you stay relevant when your very existence seems to contradict modern values? She found the answer in service. By dedicating herself completely to serving others, she transformed the monarchy from an anachronism into an institution that people genuinely valued. As the royal family returned to their vehicle for the journey back through London, the international representatives began their own departures, each carrying with them their own reflections on what they had witnessed. The gathering at St. Paul's had been unprecedented not just in its scale, but in its spirit. World leaders coming together not for negotiation or ceremony, but simply to pay their respects to someone who had earned their admiration through decades of consistent, principled leadership. President Macron, speaking to his aide as they prepared to leave the cathedral, reflected on how the Queen's approach to international relations had influenced France's own relationship with Britain despite the many policy disagreements between their nations over the decades. She never confused the person with the position, he observed. You could disagree completely with British government policy while still respecting her personally. She reminded us that diplomacy works best when it's built on human relationships rather than just political calculations. This ability to separate personal relationships from political disagreements had been one of the Queen's greatest diplomatic assets. Leaders who found themselves at odds with British policy could still maintain positive relationships with the Crown, creating channels for communication and understanding that might not otherwise have existed. As the afternoon progressed and the formal ceremonies concluded, the deeper work of processing the day's significance began. For the British people, it meant coming to terms with the loss of the only monarch most of them had ever known, while simultaneously welcoming a new king whose approach to the role would inevitably be different from his mother's. For the Commonwealth nations, it meant reaffirming their commitment to an association that had been held together largely by personal affection for the Queen. King Charles would have to prove that the Commonwealth could continue to thrive under his leadership, that the bonds forged by his mother could be maintained and strengthened by a new generation of leadership. For the international community, it meant acknowledging the end of an era of British leadership that had spanned the entire post-war period. The Queen had been a living link to the generation that had fought World War II and built the international institutions that still governed global affairs. Her passing marked not just the end of her reign, but the final closing of that chapter in world history. The evening following the service at St. Paul's was marked by quiet family gatherings as the royal family members processed their grief privately after the very public nature of the day's events. At Clarence's house, King Charles spent time alone in his study, reading through the hundreds of condolence messages that had arrived from around the world, from heads of state and ordinary citizens alike, all expressing their gratitude for his mother's life of service. Among those messages was one that particularly moved him, from a teacher in rural Kenya who had met the Queen during a Commonwealth visit decades earlier. The teacher wrote about how that brief conversation had inspired her to dedicate her life to education, how the Queen's genuine interest in her work had given her confidence to expand her small school into an institution that had educated hundreds of children over the years. Your mother showed me that greatness isn't about grand gestures, the letter concluded. It's about paying attention to people that others might overlook, about making everyone feel that their contribution matters, about using whatever power you have to lift others up. She changed my life in the space of a 5-minute conversation, and through me, she changed the lives of all the children I've been able to teach. That letter, like thousands of others, testified to the Queen's extraordinary ability to make personal connections that transcended her formal role. She had understood intuitively that monarchy in the modern world could only survive if it served a purpose beyond ceremony and tradition, if it actively contributed to people's well-being and encouraged the best in human nature. As night fell over London, St. Paul's Cathedral stood empty, but somehow still resonating with the day's events. The flowers would remain for days, visited by thousands who came to pay their own respects. The memory of what had happened within those ancient walls would endure much longer, a reminder of how a life devoted to service could inspire not just admiration, but genuine love from people around the world. The Queen's final public appearance had ended, but her legacy was just beginning its transformation into the enduring influence that would shape the monarchy and the Commonwealth for generations to come. In gathering at St. Paul's Cathedral to honor her memory, the royal family and the world's leaders had done more than say goodbye to a remarkable woman. They had affirmed their commitment to the values she had embodied and the vision of service she had spent 7 decades demonstrating.